welcome to the session on collaborative projects. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that ARSC is a nonprofit organization managed by volunteers dedicated to the preservation and study of sound recordings of all types. If you're not an ARSC, if you're an ARSC member, please consider becoming more involved by taking on a volunteer role. You can contact any board members for details. If you're not an ARSC member, please consider joining for just $25 during our conference special before June 15. You have access to hundreds of hours of past conference recordings, the ARSC journal, and a lot more. I joined ARSC for the vast knowledge and community that guide and support my work. Throughout this session, please type in and send questions via the Q&A feature in Hublot, and between sessions, please feel welcome to meet and chat with other attendees in the Hublot Lounge. And our first presentation is titled Partnering to Preserve the UCSB Early Recordings Initiative. We have David Seubert, who is the curator of the Performing Arts Collection at UC Santa Barbara, where he manages the recorded sound archives. He's the project director of the UCSB Cylinder Audio Archive and a discography of American historical recordings, two internationally recognized research and digitization projects documenting early sound recordings with a goal of making them more widely accessible to scholars and the public. David has a degree in music from Oberlin College and an MLIS from University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a past president of ARSC and an appointed member of the National Recording Preservation Board of the Library of Congress. Heather Silva is the Senior Director of Development at UCSB, where she manages all fundraising activities for the library. Prior to this, she was the Director of Programming and Special Initiatives at UCSB Arts and Lectures and served as the Board President of California Presenters. She was a longtime curator of the Forum Lounge at the Museum of Contemporary Arts Santa Barbara and was the Artistic Director of On Edge Festival. Heather holds BA in Art History from University of Notre Dame and an MA in Art History and Museum Studies from University of Southern California. Dr. Lidia Uziel is the Associate University Librarian for Research Resources and Scholarly Communication at UCSB. She holds leadership, management, strategic policy, and planning responsibilities for general and special collections, scholarly communication program, and technical services operations. Prior to that, Lidia held several leadership positions at Harvard and Yale University libraries. Alongside several professional engagements, Lidia is a committee member of the COAPI SPARC, an advisory board member of the NGPL Coalition, a co-PI on the COPIN project, and a member of the International Collections and Content Group Center for Research Libraries. John Levin is a media professional with experience in public radio, home entertainment, and B2B video marketing. He's a prolific collector of cylinder and disc recordings with over 3,000 early cylinder records. Because of the unique challenges associated with these recordings, John has developed technology for audition and archival transfer with minimal wear, currently in use at the Henri Temianka Audio Preservation Lab at UCSB. This technology includes V-Trace, the only contemporary cartridges designed to play cylinders. At present, John is developing with UCSB the Early Recordings Initiative, which you're excited to hear about, a public-private partnership focused on the conservation of and public access to pre-1903 recordings. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lidia Uziel. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Research Resources and Scholarly Communication at the UC Santa Barbara Library. As Miyuki said, I oversee the Special Research Collections, which now includes the Early Recordings Initiative as part of our Performing Arts Collection. We are very excited to be here today to present this new initiative at UCSB. But before providing some context about this initiative, I want to very briefly discuss the role that the UCSB Library and academic libraries in general play in the larger context of scholarship and research. As one of the largest academic library systems in the world, the University of California has a deep commitment to its leadership role in transforming scholarly communication towards open access. Without going into details of facts and figures regarding the UC system, I want to say that the UC system has long been a leader in the open access movement, and today we are at the forefront of the open access transformation. With a dynamic and innovative community of librarians and curators, the UC leads the broader conversation in North America and internationally around transforming the current scholarly publishing ecosystem. In addition, the UC Santa Barbara Library has been participating in international partnership supporting the community-owned non-profit publishing infrastructure and empowering the transition to open access of academic and scholar-led presses. The role of academic library is to enable exploration and collaboration to create knowledge individually and collectively, and also to support UC's mission of teaching, research, and public service. The University of California libraries provide access to the world's knowledge to scholars at all UC campuses and also to the scholarly communities at large. The UCSB library partners in the creation of new research and scholarship with our faculty and students and with a broader community, while we also manage our general research collections and steward our special, unique, and distinctive collections. In fact, the mission of our Special Research Collection Department is to acquire, preserve, promote, and provide access to a world-class collection of manuscripts and archives, rare books, photographs, film and media content, sound recordings, and other rare and unique materials that tell the story of our collective past. The two basic tenets of special collections are long-term preservation and access. The library strives to ensure that our primary source materials will be responsibly preserved with committed long-term resources to support this effort. And unlike private institutions that require scholarly credentials to access rare materials, all content in our special collection is available to anyone to access through our digitization facilities, whether it is a scholar or simply a community member. Housed in a new state-of-the-art facility, our special collections are renowned for their diversity, uniqueness, scarcity, and more importantly, for very significant research strengths in several collecting areas. Under the leadership of curator David Seubert, the performing arts collection has flourished and continue to greatly influence scholarship and research nationally and internationally. It includes an extraordinary collection of the first sound recordings produced on a commercial scale. Many of these early recordings are rare, are truly unique. Nevertheless, research institutions and private collectors are merely stewards of these objects, which by all rights should belong to the public. Most of the records from the earliest years of the record industry and produced between 1889 and 1903 are fragile brown wax cylinders. Today, it's estimated that fewer than 6% of the 22,000 cylinder titles issued before 1902 have survived. Among the first years of this era, the percentage of surviving examples is far lower. To proactively mitigate these potential losses, the UCSB Library recently launched the Early Recording Initiative, an innovative partnership with a private collector, John Levin, and focused on acquisition, long-term conservation and stewardship, digitization, research, and public access to the earliest and rarest sound recordings. And as this collection grows, it will cement the UCSB library's reputation as a world-class resource and also a prime repository for these earliest recordings. The UCSB commitment to the long-term stewardship and preservation of this content has been significantly strengthened by our partnership with John and by his vision for an endowment which will continue to support these efforts long beyond my tenure at UCSB, David's tenure, and also our current university leadership. And with that, I will now pass it on to John, who will discuss the Early Recording Initiative in more detail. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's hard and frankly a little humbling to focus on early recordings because they're just a tiny part of the immense holdings and resources of the University of California, much less UCSB Library's Performing Arts Collection. But I will, and I'll start with a bit about what we mean by early recordings. First, most of them are cylinder recordings. Even though people tend to think of cylinders as an odd and ephemeral format, the fact is they were in production for about 40 years, one of the longest runs of any analog or digital audio format. The first era of commercial recordings, records made between 1889 and about 1903, are the ones we term early recordings. There was no practical means of cylinder mass production then. Almost all were made in small batches, using a group of recording machines for each take, and then mechanically copying them, yielding at most a few hundred sale copies. This period challenges our conventional thinking about records and their cataloging. About 20% of them have no catalog numbers at all. Some have catalog numbers that changed over the life of the title. And then most extant recordings are not copies per se. They're versions recorded over and over, sometimes for years, with the same name and catalog number, but nothing else in common. Often they're quite different from each other, and because usually there's no information on the record itself, knowing what record company and exactly when these records were made is often a big challenge. Beyond the recordings, there are the challenges of the physical carrier itself. Before mass production was introduced, records were made from a soft and very fragile metallic soap, which people then and now call brown wax. Like soap, brown wax is highly sensitive to humidity, temperature, and other effects that degrade the medium. I did a presentation on this at last year's ARSC conference, explaining that while these effects are still not fully understood, their impacts are. What's called cylinder mold, for the most part, is not readily removable. It destroys the underlying medium, and it degrades or destroys the original recording. Another major issue with brown wax is its fragility. It breaks more easily than glass. Plus, like soap, it's really soft. So even when cylinders have miraculously spent most of their 120 plus years in relatively stable, low humidity environments, they are still prone to cracking and shattering from improper handling. Then too, there are the effects of period equipment. While early spring-motored machines were workhorses built for hundreds of hours of use, brown wax cylinders are no match for the low compliance and high stylus pressures of early equipment that most collectors still use to play them. The most gentle reproducer of the time, the Edison Automatic, tracks at about 10 grams, and it's linked to an ultra-low compliance glass diaphragm. With every play, it incrementally flattens, scores, and deforms the minute undulations that are vertically cut in the soft wax. Now, none of this is new news. The environmental degradation of brown wax was known back in the 1890s, and Tim Brooks pointed out the effects of improper handling almost 20 years ago. But for me, as a focused collector of brown wax, this is a train wreck in slow motion that I've been watching for over 30 years. And the result is that today, there are pages and pages of 1890s recordings that haven't surfaced. There are many prominent pre-1900 artists that we've never heard. They're recordings that were documented in private collections years ago that have now disappeared. And there are many heartbreaking examples of cylinders now unintelligible that were in half-decent shape when transferred to tape in the 1970s. Clearly, early recordings are not in the same category as the later, much more durable cylinder and disc formats, which were mass-produced in quantity with a common release date and all copies the same, often backed up by masters that still exist. Further, based on the destruction and degradation that I've seen, I can state categorically that at the rate we're going, the vast majority of early recordings will be destroyed in 20 to 30 years unless something's done. And as you can see, almost 20 years ago, Tim Brooks predicted the same fate. So what do we do? Well, there's a good analogy today for early recordings. They have the same status as endangered species. Take the giant panda, for example. Once scientists confirmed that it was threatened with extinction due to loss of habitat, the only way to preserve it was by creating a managed and protected environment for them. Plus, and this is important, the preservation of the panda as well as other endangered species succeeds because groups have worked to make them more prominent and visible, which in turn builds support, funding, and further broadens awareness. The brown wax collection I have built is more than records I've acquired. I've spent a lot of time unraveling the mysteries of these cylinders, musically, technically, contextually. I've experienced their rarity, and I have worked hard to define it with a custom cataloging system that is marked standards-based, developed by Yuri Shimoda and me when she was at UCLA. So I was understandably anxious to avoid another one of Tim's prescient comments in Lost Sounds, scattering my curated collection like chaff in the wind. It made no sense. Equally senseless was to give or sell the collection to an organization that would condemn it to obscurity because it is not public-facing. Like the giant panda, these treasures need to be protected, and equally important, they need to be made available to everyone. But I am only one collector, only one panda. It takes more than one panda to save the species. So my donated collection is just a starting point. There are important early recordings in pockets all over the world. They need protection. They need to be aggregated to facilitate deeper study, and they all need access via online publishing. I started talking with David Seubert about this many years ago, and we discussed the unique category of recordings and their special status. As we talked about the problem, the significant need clarified, and early goals clarified too. As we focused on each goal, a general structure emerged. At that point, David threaded in Heather Silva, Senior Director of Development at the UCSB Library, and between the three of us, the Early Recordings Initiative, or ERI, started to take shape. Heather will explain.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. The ERI was actually developed to create a pathway for early recorded sound preservation through the combined efforts of private collectors like John and the public research institution like UCSB, with multiple avenues to maximize the financial potential for collection donations. So while based in the performing arts collection, the ERI is actually a public-private partnership with John. When John came to UCSB with more than an offer of an important collection needing a home and this idea of the initiative, we recognized the uniqueness of this partnership opportunity. He challenged us to envision a legacy program that would support the preservation of his collection and others, while leveraging the library's already existing resources and commitment to this area of collecting. So what emerged in discussion was a multifaceted program and pathway for a large-scale collection development and preservation effort to save brown wax cylinders from extinction. What we came up with was the Early Recordings Initiative, which now exists as a permanent program at the library through the John Levin Early Recordings Fund. The best way to visualize ERI is as a stool with 3 legs. At the top of the stool is the ERI Platform, and as part of the UCSB Library's Performing Arts collection, ERI holdings are an integral part of its resources with state-of-the-art storage and support by the library's special research collection staff. But equally important, as they are digitized and published online, all ERI holdings and their metadata are readily accessible via the Cylinder Audio Archive, our digital online repository. The final piece of the ERI platform is programming. We plan to sponsor diverse activities under ERI, including funded fellowships and research, webinars and scholarly panels on various topics, live music programs and exhibitions, and other special events that promote the initiative. In fact, we just had a recent event featuring Colin Hancock and his California Orchestra, which also got picked up as a story in the BBC World Service, which has an average weekly audience of 1.2 million listeners around the world. This is a great shot of the event here at the library, including John. Supporting this platform are ERI's legs. The first leg is our collections. So current ERI materials include the John Levin collection, of course, which comprises of over 3,000 brown wax cylinders, and which will be digitized once they are received by the library so that they can be made discoverable and widely accessible. But this world-class collection joins other important UCSB early cylinder holdings, including the Alan G. Debus collection and the Edward Picor collection. The second leg is acquisitions. This is the pathway I mentioned for significant collections to go into permanent conservation and public access. Collections can be acquired outright through a purchase. They can be donated for a full tax deduction, or they can be contributed via a combination of both. All acquisitions retain the name of the private collector or donor in perpetuity as part of their provenance. And by building upon the existing John Levin collection, the ERI will actively pursue selective acquisitions that enrich and complement our holdings of pre-1903 recordings. The final leg is funding, which of course is an essential component of ERI. So acquisitions may be funded through the John Levin Early Recordings Fund or through other library resources. Our commitment to the ERI is to support collectors' interests in partnering with the library and to provide options for collection donation and financial support of ERI. By thinking about the future and laying out legacy plans with collectors, we can support their investment in their collection, along with considering various financial incentives. So ultimately, the ERI gives collectors the opportunity for their collection to be accessed, admired, and cared for beyond their lifetime. And as donors to the university, collectors who contribute to the ERI are recognized publicly for their generosity via university publications, at ERI public events, and reflected as part of donated materials metadata. You can see here a few examples of what this looks like. For those of you who are collectors in the group who've been cultivating collections for decades, it may be time to ask yourself two questions. How do I want to preserve my legacy of collecting? And how do I want to be known by future generations of collectors? For John, that meant partnering with UCSB to ensure that his collection will be preserved and that all of his work researching the objects, caring for them, and developing the collection over the years will be reflected in his legacy endowment. The ERI is a pathway for you as a collector to make a plan for your collection's future and to publicly recognize your role in its preservation. So now David will tell you more about how the library approaches our collection development and stewardship for ERI collections.
Thank you, Heather. One of the organizing principles of ARSC when it was founded 56 years ago was the need to bring together institutions and private collectors sharing a common goal of preserving our recorded heritage. That's why it's called the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, not the Association of Recorded Sound Collections. ARSC has largely been successful at navigating this tricky space, and the successes are too numerous to mention. UC Santa Barbara has benefited directly from this as the home of donations and acquisitions from prominent ARSC members, including Bill Morin, David Giovannoni, Don Hill, Reiner Lotz, Fred Williams, Alan Debus, and others. As a curator, I've had and continue to have important and meaningful relationships with private collectors. Much of what I know is due to my relationships with them, sharing information, learning about their interests, and discovering new music and recordings with them. But at an institutional level, these relationships tend to be mostly passive. Via a gift, bequest, or purchase, a collection moves from private ownership into a public collection. But what if this relationship could be something more? What if the institution and donor had a real partnership with a goal of preserving and making accessible recorded sound collections? Through ARSC, institutions and individuals have been collaborating since its founding, but as the ERI took shape, we wanted to make this partnership a more active one, leveraging the respective strengths that institutions and private collectors bring to the table. UCSB began digitizing cylinder recordings 20 years ago, and the UCSB Cylinder Audio Archive debuted in the fall of 2005. At the time, very little of what we had digitized would fit the rubric of early recordings that we've defined in the ERI. That's how far off the institutional radar these items were. A quick OCLC search finds less than 500 19th century titles made by Edison Columbia represented in libraries other than those held by UCSB. Thanks to John and others, UCSB's collection of brown wax cylinders has now grown substantially in the past 10 years. And through the ERI, we will make them an explicit focus of our preservation efforts. Articulating them as different from other cylinders and other recordings is important, as even knowledgeable recorded sound professionals and collectors tend to lump everything together in a giant bucket called cylinders. It was at the intersection of a private collector's knowledge and passion and UCSB's institutional capacity that the ERI was born, and it is a natural collaboration considering our long relationship with John, our long-standing efforts to preserve and digitize recordings of all kinds. It provides focus to our efforts. It provides financial support that can help ensure that important activities that have made our program successful continue long into the future, and it articulates what we are doing and why we are doing it. John's wisdom in establishing the John Levin Early Recordings Fund is a testament to his commitment to preserving these early cultural artifacts. The Early Recordings Initiative has several goals, some of which Heather has outlined, that are worth noting explicitly. The goals include acquisition of appropriate and significant collections, the preservation and maintenance of these collections, but we've already been doing this, so there has to be more. We want ERI to foster research, including on conservation and preservation, as well as on research on digitization, cataloging, or even the study of the corporate history that explains why things are the way they are. Outreach, programming, and public access are important as well. Promoting the ERI mission will be an important component of the program. The ERI launch event at UCSB a few weeks ago with Colin Hancock's California Orchestra cutting a cylinder live was one such promotional activity. While it doesn't directly relate to preservation, it lured 80 people into a room for a public event to listen and learn. And those people now know something more about these things we are calling early recordings and are now aware of the challenges and the resulting need for ERI. As collections make their way from private ownership to public collections, one may wonder why we have 4 copies of the Greater New York Quartet waxing the old oaken bucket for Columbia Records in the late 1890s. With the ERI to guide us, this will hopefully make more sense now to collectors who think we already have everything, or to administrators concerned about space and resources, and to historians who will now have a critical mass of these early recordings to study. The ERI articulates why the UCSB Cylinder Audio Archive is not static, but will grow indefinitely, and that sifting through thousands of recordings a year is still important, and that collectors are our partners in this. They clearly aren't all the same as they might appear at first glance, and adding a 5th or 6th copy of the old oaken bucket, all unique recordings, is important. The 1890s was the decade when sound recordings went from an experimental technology and amusing novelty to a mass market consumer entertainment format. The industry which it created is still with us today and as influential as ever. Preserving the earliest manifestations of this industry is our mandate. Communicating with collectors that these rare survivors in their den, the music room, or basement are not only theirs, but also everyone's, and that we all have a responsibility to steward them for the next generation, and hopefully see them with an eventual home in a responsible institution, a Panda Park for cylinders where they can happily live out their lives in safety and security. Our hope is that the ERI will make Tim Brooks's worst case scenario, where preserving what remains will have been solved through simple attrition through neglect, by bringing attention to these rare survivors from the past. Finally, the UCSB library team would be happy to engage with you further at any point on the ERI. UCSB is institutionally committed to these efforts long-term. Lidia, Heather, and I would be happy to discuss ERI further in our respective roles in administration, development, and curation. Thank you very much.